Okay. So this one has been on my fridge for a while now. And I kind of lost, I was doing a lot of stuff physics related, a lot of talks with that. And I kind of just got bored. I lost my interest in it, and mythology and ancient history just became way more interesting to me because, call it arrogance, but I feel like, I kind of solved it in my mind. So I was kind of like, I felt like I was just saying the same thing. And I have definitely more to add and more to expand and taking it to another level, but I just haven't felt like it's time yet. And, I felt like I've progressed that far enough. So, let the world catch up. And I'll work on something else. Right. But this has been on my fridge, and I'm trying to, move through everything that I have lying around so that everything is consolidated onto, my phone or something. And so I have this drawing with, it's more words than anything really. But basically, there is standard deviation, right? And if you observe anything, you will find that just about everything, given enough time and enough instances, will shape itself to occur seemingly according to this standard deviation, right? This curve of standard deviation is just almost universal. Like, you'll find this all over the place, right? And so I find this very interesting, right? So it's the standard distribution of probability, right? And so, I was thinking about this, and it's like, why that shape, right? And so if you also look at this shape from a 3D perspective, it creates, you can find pi in the standard deviation, because when you look from 3D rather than just a 2D slice like this, and you spin it around to make a full three-dimensional shape, that obviously makes circles, right? And so when you slice it, instead of going like this, you slice it like this, you get different circles. And so you can find pi in the standard deviation. I think it's 3 Blue 1 Brown that did a video about that. And I found that very interesting, how pi keeps showing up in all these places, right? It's like, why does pi keep showing up all over the place? And it's because I think, this is my theory, circle is just the most efficient method of distribution, right? If you want to distribute evenly, circle. It's an even distribution in all directions. And, thinking about the shape of the standard distribution, right? I watched a video talking about the angle of repose, right? And I thought this was interesting. Standard deviation may be the angle of repose for reality. And that may sound ridiculous and absurd, but it is based off of a similar premise, because in an angle of repose with something that's just like sand, right? You do a pile of sand, and once the sand pile gets too high, it just causes an avalanche and it rolls off the top, right? And then it has to land at the bottom and then build that sand back up before it'll slide again, right? And so that's what angle of repose is. If you don't know what angle of repose is, it's the amount of angle you can have with a certain material before it basically slides off or causes an avalanche. And so avalanches are a big area where this is concerned. Also, I think quarries are something that this is a big concern with, and probably also like roads and things, and just building development because of soil and erosion and things along those lines. So anyway, lots of practical applications for the angle of repose. However, when you think about it from a reality perspective, why is this probability of occurrences happening? Well, if you think of every occurrence, every potential occurrence, every instance, every probability, right? Every occurred data point in your distribution, your standard distribution, every data point is a potential occurrence that falls into your reality. It's like, what happens if this happens? What happens if this happens, right? And all these things can drop out from the previous actions, right? And so you have basically your pile starting drop, right? That is defining your pile, basically, right? So you drop a material on the ground, and then you keep dropping more of that material onto the ground, like material onto the ground, and as it accumulates, it creates a pile, right? And so every single action, every single instance is of a like material, and so it occurs in a like area, and as they pile up, they reach to a certain point, and this limit, this standard deviation limit, where where the slope occurs, is what I believe, what serves as the delineation as what is within and without the possibility of reality, right? Anything that is on the outside of this curve, right, is too different from the initial cause to fall in the area, right? Anything that's within the curve is similar enough to the current action to be probable and possible in that reality, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, you can sit there, right, and you're trying to find out what animals will appear in a park, right? And so you're in a park and you're sitting there and you're watching the animals and you're observing to see how many animals show up, and you're probably getting a lot of squirrels, different species of birds, things along those lines, right? But something you're probably not expecting, say if you live in, Canada, right? If you're out in the middle of nowhere, Canada, you're not expecting an elephant to start strutting its way through the park, right? And the thing is it impossible? The answer is no. There are many realities, many situations, many reasons why an elephant could strut through the park you're in, right? It's not out of the question to happen. However, right, the reality in which it happens is not the one you're in, right? And so it doesn't occur, right? But if it does occur, all of a sudden, you're no longer in the reality you were in initially. Now you're no longer underneath the curve. Now you're outside the curve, and it seeds a new probability, right? Because, well, if an elephant walked through, that totally changes the game. Now all kinds of other circus animals could start walking through, right? You could get a giraffe. Who knows? Like, right? That changes the scenario. It's too dissimilar from the initial scenario to be within that scenario's limits, right? And so, basically, you have your seed event that starts everything, and then as more events occur, they either fall within or without of the curve. And the events outside the curve happen, they just don't occur in your reality because they're too dissimilar from the initial conditions to fall within, right? Without external conditions being altered, there is no way to get them into your reality. That doesn't mean that you can't move into that reality. It just means that your current reality, you find yourself within a certain scope, right? And so there's a standard deviation of what can happen, right? But if you change the conditions, then the distribution shifts, right? And it doesn't, all you do is change one condition, but the whole distribution can shift in a given direction, right? If you make it hotter, it might move this way. If you make it colder, it might move this way, right? If you move it up in elevation, it might, move, more left or more right or something along these lines, right? Like it'll shift back and forth, or, maybe the distribution will rather either be really steep or it'll be very low, right? It'll be a very diverse spread, right? Like depending on your conditions, you are changing the angle of repose, and you are changing the limitations of this reality that you are within, right? And if you find yourself, you wouldn't notice this change, right? Because you were just following this path, right? But you could eventually find yourself outside of what your initial conditions were due to a sequence of events that slowly shifted you further and further outside the bounds. However, if you compare where you are now compared to where you started, the potential for this to happen is completely outside of the standard distribution. It's basically zero, right? And so what happened is you fell off the pile, right? You slid off in the avalanche, right? You got carried in a direction you weren't necessarily anticipating because the angle of repose reached its climax, right? It reached its maximum limitation, and then you went over it, right? And slid off into a whole nother scenario. And so, what do I have written here? Basically, I have the original event, which is the most probable, right? That's what typically tends to happen, and that's usually what you experience in your reality. You are always living the most probable outcome or the most probable event for every instance, right? Me speaking right now, me giving this talk is the most probable outcome for my life, right? And that is just how it always is, based off of how I'm moving, right? But the conditions around me change where I fall next, right? The words that come out of my mouth next depend on the words that have just come out of my mouth now. And so at every given instance, the most probable outcome is shifting. So it's not a straight line down kind of thing. It's okay, you move this way, right? You land, you move straight, but there's it's not a pinball machine. What is that where you put like a coin in and then it'll like bounce back and forth and it'll go bing, 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 and you don't know exactly where it's going to end up. It's like those coin machines. That's what it is. At like arcades that just like push the coins, and you're trying to get the coins to pile up so they fall off, right? But you put your coin in where you think, oh, it's going to boop, 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 fall here, but sometimes it could go boop, 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 and fall away on the other side, and you're like, ah! But that's a part of the game, right? You're pretty confident it'll end up right there, but there's minor changes, minor inconsistencies in, your timing and the positioning and the coin itself and the pins and all these things that have slight effects that lead to it, going in a potentially unpredictable path. However, it's just following the most probable direction given its initiating information, right? And so that is us. That is what we do. That is our life, right? And in theory, it is predictable if you have enough information. However, we do not have enough information. And so for us, it is seemingly random, but at the same time, completely probable, or something along those lines. I don't know if that was necessarily the best wording for it, right? Every instance is certain, but nothing beyond that is, if that makes sense, which is kind of a paradox, right? Because if every instance is certain, shouldn't everything just be certain? So maybe that's not the proper term or the way of saying it, but maybe it is. I don't know. I'm getting lost on a tangent. We're going to continue on. You can chew on that maybe. I don't know if I'll ever come back to it. Maybe I will. Right, and so basically you're just following through these iterations from the present to the future. I have, as time progresses, other potential timelines emerge due to mutation and evolution that establish their own distribution of probability. So That's interesting. I forgot that I brought this in here. So there's mutation and evolution, right? So every instance, it has a seemingly probable outcome. However, there's random things that can occur that are outside of initial expectations, right? The information was there if you had the data to know this was going to happen. But if you don't have the data, this is a seemingly random event that mutates the current trajectory, and over time, what is probable evolves, right? It seems like, oh, this is the most probable outcome. This is the most probable outcome. But if something in the situation, in the scenario changes, as I said before, the temperature or height or direction, right? Something changes, then all of a sudden, the system evolves to meet that system's most probable outcomes, right? And all of a sudden the distribution shifts, right? Because that is the most favorable outcome, right? That is what survives. Everything else falls outside of reality, right? So if you think about it from, a biological perspective, the species that adapt to their surroundings are the ones that survive. And so the outcomes and the probabilities that fall into the shifted area are the ones that survive, and therefore they continue to pile up there. And because that is now the favorable outcome, that is the reality that you are living in. Those actions pile up in your reality because that's what survives in your reality. Everything else does not exist in your reality. It falls into a different reality, right? It can't exist here. I don't know. Right. So what happens within the area can be considered comparable. Outside this limit is too dissimilar to be considered the same event and timeline path. Right. So as I was saying before, the angle of repose, everything else falls outside and is not within that reality. Everything else is similar enough to the reality that it is considered within. Right. And so the circle is the most efficient method of dispersion. Reality evolved to align with it, right? So not only is things like occurrences evolving and adapting to your reality to exist in your reality, but reality itself, why does standard distribution exist? As I said, the circle is the most efficient method of distribution. And so, a certain event evolves, it becomes an existence of its own, right? And because it exists, it then disperses outwards in a circular path, in a circular direction all around it, right? Because if right here is safe, then the immediate area right around it is probably safe, and then the immediate area right around it is probably safe, and you gotta you don't know which direction is best. You disperse out in all directions equally until you reach a limit where you can't, right? And so after a certain limit, that's where it's no longer survivable, right? And so the initial seed event lands and it'll disperse out evenly, right? And that is why you have this is where pi comes from, the circular distribution, and this is why you end up with this kind of rounded dome to the standard distribution, and it's because the circle is the most efficient method of distribution, and reality itself has evolved to accommodate that, right? The fundamental truth that a circle is the most efficient method of distribution is just a fundamental law governed by geometry. And so, how do you prove that? I don't know how you do the mathematical proof to prove that, but if you just observe, there's no more efficient method of dispersion that can equally spread out and maximize area coverage at the same, like there's a reason why everything kind of puddles up, and without anything getting in its way, it'll just evenly, like you make like you pour water out, as long as there's nothing obstructing it or causing it to alter its spillage path, it's going to just kind of spread out in all directions evenly, because that's the most efficient way to distribute the mass, or to distribute outwards. Like that's just I'm getting lost in trying to explain this, because I'm trying to make it I don't know if you can really fundamentally prove it. It's just objectively true. And so I just think it's what I find most fascinating about this is that reality has evolved to optimize itself for this very fact, right? Species and mass and all these things all around the world have evolved. Like, as I was saying, water and the laws of physics behave in the way they do because it is the most probable and most efficient method, right? It gives the best chance of survival, right? And that's why species use it, because it is just the most efficient and effective method. And so, that's what leads to this, circles everywhere kind of, reality that we live in. There's circles everywhere because, honestly, arguably, circle distribution being just a fundamental law is not necessarily universal. It does not need to be that way. It just is in our, it is in our reality. However, it does not necessarily need to be the case. Like, there could be a world where, for some reason, geometry allows a square to be the most efficient method of distribution, it just feels so weird to think like that. But I feel like that's actually a more true statement, to say that it's really not a fundamental law. And the reason why I'm having trouble coming up with a proof is because it's really not true universally. Well, it's true universally. We need a bigger term than universe, right? Like it's true in our reality, but it is not true beyond our reality necessarily. It's likely that it's true for our local region of reality. Like, everything around us is probably similar, right? Because again, we get onto this distribution and the circle thing, right? It most likely, how this would look is you would have to jump realities, right? Where it's okay, circle is the best, and then it starts getting more ovalish, right? It gets like oblonged, and then it starts deforming out in the other directions, turns more into like a plus sign, and then slowly bends out into a square or a rectangle or something along those lines. And it wouldn't be like, okay, circle's the best, and then you jump over and, oh, now square is the best. It would be you would have to, transition your way over there, right? It's not a quick like jump, because where we're located, circle is the best, which is, I don't know if it's really opposites, but it's got to be pretty far from a square, I'd imagine. Maybe not. I don't know, right? Reality is whatever you want it to be, or it could be whatever you want it to be. So I don't know, right? These are just my theories and such and things. And so, this process continues to repeat with smaller and smaller, so what I mean by that is so me speaking is an event, right? And so, the probability and the standard distribution and the probabilistic distribution of the air that is moving around, in front of my mouth from me speaking is like a smaller scale of this probability taking place, right? And then there is also the way that the air affects other air in the room that is also being like a smaller distribution is happening, and then the molecules and the atoms are interacting, and then you go smaller and then the atoms are interacting, you go to subatomic particles, and then you go to the vacuum energy is interacting due to this, right? So within the reality, right, there's an event that takes place, and then there are a ton of events that seed off of it that are not all necessarily observable to you, but will continue on to infinity, because there's just, well, I don't know if it's really infinity, right? It'll continue it'll continue having actions occur underneath the standard distribution. Underneath the standard distribution, there is an infinite amount of actions that occur and will occur for the rest of time. However, there is a finite limit to that action, right? So, as I said, every word that I say, I mean, it can get even more granular than that, but we'll just generalize it to every word that I'm saying is an instance. It is an event that is happening, right? And so, for every word that I speak, at the end of that word, that's the end of that instance. However, for the rest of time, which this is going to seem like a paradox because I just said that every word ends that thing. However, in that span of me speaking, there is infinite time that takes place at shorter and shorter scales, right? So these interactions are happening faster and faster and faster as they get smaller and smaller and smaller. When we're heading towards things like the vacuum energy and potentially beyond, right? In my theory, basically, there is no end, right? So things keep getting smaller indefinitely. And because things keep getting smaller indefinitely, the time scale at which interactions take place gets faster and faster from our perspective. However, the time span stays consistent for the scale that you're at. And so for me, when I say a word, the end of the word happens and that event ends for me. However, that event then takes place for the rest of time, right? Till infinity. There will always be some point of that event that has not fully taken place yet, right? The full repercussions of every action that I make, every action that I live, every event that I experience will continue to have effects and reverberate out in that instant of time until the end of time. Which, like, what I'm saying sounds absurd. It's like, what are you saying? What do you mean? And honestly, I don't even know if I know exactly what I mean by this. But it's just because things get so weird so quickly. But time is relative. And so every word I speak is the end of time. Every instant of life is an eternity on some scale, but not my scale, right? But on some scale, the end of time will never happen because it's constantly getting smaller and smaller and faster and faster and faster and faster and faster, right? It keeps dividing in half. Technically, if you keep dividing in half, you will never reach the actual destination, but practically, you will, because if you have it in half, then you have, and I'm basically there, right? I'm basically at my hand. However, from a mathematical perspective and in reality, you will never get to the other, the end, because there will always be another half. There is always a smaller scale. There will always be a smaller half you can cut. Practically speaking, no, we can't go past a certain range. We can't observe past a certain range, but that doesn't mean that doesn't continue. That doesn't mean that it then just disappears and it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist necessarily to us. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist at all, right? And so this is really just kind of a bizarre thing to think about because we see ourselves as these creatures that are living in a finite world with, finite limits. But if you look at it from a different perspective, everything we do is infinitely powerful and infinitely timeless and just infinitely bizarre. And it is just fascinating to see that kind of play out in the world around you. And I feel like this really just this expanded this talk ended up expanding even farther in scope than I necessarily initially expected. So on some sense, I think I tumbled out of my initial initial instance, right? Something mutated something mutated the initial event of me starting this talk and the initial thought and the initial idea, right? And it mutated during this talk into a reality that is different. It is new, right? This is a new reality that I'm now in, right? Because not everything that I said were things that I was necessarily expecting to say before I started, which is why I also love doing these talks. And it just really gets me thinking in a way that I wasn't necessarily always thinking before, and I enjoy that a lot. And so basically, reality is very crazy, and it's a lot more complicated and at the same time simple than we tend to think. And there's a lot more going on than we realize, and you know, it it's really fascinating stuff. So yeah. Peace out.